Washington Historical Society meeting on Saturday afternoon, June 22nd, in the year 2002. And today we have the privilege of taking a walking tour and a visit to Cold Spring Farm on Deep Hollow Road in Lithgow, just outside of Millbrook. And this is where Louise Tompkins, who was our former town historian, lived as a child with her grandparents, William and Louisa Hale, in the early 1900s. Louise wrote articles for the Millbrook Roundtable for years about the early days of Millbrook, and many of the stories that she talked about took place on the farm. She talked about her pony and where she learned to milk the cow and the big meadow and the spring house and all the various sites on the farm. And today we're going to be able to walk around the farm and see those sites and have the house explained to us. David Greenwood, our town historian, is going to give us the walk and the talk and explain and get a little bit of a tour as we walk along. And so I'm sure it's going to be a very, very interesting meeting.
Have all the information. The wonderful thing about this historical society is that with people like Ginny and Jean and all of you, we share. And by pooling that, we all learn so much more about it. Deep Hollow is called Deep Hollow because there's a hollow, and we're in it, and it happens to be very deep, hence the name. If you think of the mountain range and the 22 corridor, north-south, Dutchess County, Columbia, and Putnam all have a mountain range in common. We are at the top, almost of a plateau, a series of hills that run, by and large, north-south. Route 22 is in the long corridor that runs virtually from north in Columbia all the way down to the Connecticut Sound. On the other side of Route 22, if you think about it, there's another ridge. And then you go over that ridge and you're down to Route 7 in Connecticut. And Route 7 is exactly the same. So we have, in essence, two parallel ridges with valleys in between. Why is that important for us? When you're on a plateau area, like the town of Washington, the hills become a major barrier. If we're going north-south, that's fine, but how do we get from here to Route 22 and the 10-mile river and the grazing properties that are in the valleys? By the hollows. And the hollows really were naturally occurring clefts in those hill ranges. And each of those clefts became, in the 18th century, based on Indian travel, those clefts became the roadways. Deep Hollow, at our end, the Route 44 end, connects relatively good farmland and pasture. And I have to say relatively, because it depends a lot on the crops and what you're looking for. It connects those relatively good pastures with Wausek and what would become a railroad corridor, an important railroad corridor in the 1860s, 1870s. Borden, you think of Dale Borden. Borden's Creamery and canned milk factory was actually in that 22 corridor, Wausek. And at the very end of this cleft, Deep Hollow, we had and still have charcoal furnaces. Now, charcoal, you think about what people needed in the 18th and 19th century. What was important, what wasn't important. Charcoal is made from hardwood. Hardwood, by and large, grows in all of these clefts and all of these hollows. The property, imagine trying to farm in this area. This part is pretty good, but you go down another quarter of a mile and you realize it's virtually impossible. What does it have? Hardwoods, lots of oaks. And the hardwood would be harvested, taken down Deep Hollow, to to those furnaces, and charcoal would be created. Now, why is charcoal so important? By the 1780s, New York City was virtually out of wood. They burned it all. The city was dependent on other sources then for heating. Charcoal was used for that. Soft coal was coming from Pennsylvania up through the Hudson Valley to places like New York City and to Albany. In 1823, the Erie Canal opened up past Albany and Troy with the greater part of New York and the Great Lakes. But charcoal is what fueled most of the furnaces for making steel and iron, but also in New York, it was the fuel of choice for cooking. So charcoal became a major industry, and this corridor took that. Also in the 19th century with the railroad, milk. It's a pretty direct route to Wassail. And Gale Borden's process. Gale Borden made his fortune because of government contracts during the Civil War. He was able to condense milk, and it meant that soldiers had two things: condensed milk, but another byproduct of the canning industry, Campbell's and beans. If it hadn't been for the Civil War, Campbell's wouldn't have gotten the jump on that, and Borden wouldn't have gotten the condensed milk. So that's sort of an overview of why this cleft is so important. Now, if we look at the houses along here, from Deep Hollow at the other end, where St. Peter's is, pretty good farmland. The large estate at that end was Lithgow, the Johnston estate, named after Linlithgow, which is in Scotland. And Jameson, the original owner of that tract, was one of the 9 partners and owned quite a bit of property. If we look at Dutchess County history, town of Washington history, if you look at it from a religious point of view, Linlithgow, was an area dominated by Anglicans, Church of England, by and large. If you go to some of the other hamlets, they're Quaker hamlets. Places like Mechanic, 9 Partners, were Quaker communities. St. Peter's is here because of Linlithgow and Lithgow, the estate. If we look at the early families that settled along this area, we've got 2 different groups. We've got the Anglicans that I just mentioned, but we also have a strong Quaker profile. So almost every family that we look at in the 18th, early 19th century were either Quaker or Anglican, Episcopal with St. Peter's. Directly across from St. Peter's, we have what some of us know as Rose Lawn, and that's the Place estate. But much, much earlier, the Hammonds lived there, a number of local families, and each house that runs along from the intersection of 44th right down through the cleft, the roadway, down into Amenia, each has an association that goes back to those Quaker and or Anglican roots. What Ginny has done is photocopied, and it's somewhere, she'll point it out to you, the census from 1860, is it? The agricultural census. And if you look at the family names, you find out what kind of farm these were. Farther up on Tower Hill, where the property was better, the volume of animals, the number of sheep, horses, cows, greatly increased. As we get down into the cleft and the property becomes more and more hardscrabble, suddenly less and less and less animals for it. The Tompkins family, Louise's family, really would have been seen as a hardscrabble farm. Very poor, very modest, small amount of animals, very hard existence. Louise's story of growing up at her grandparents doesn't reflect really how poor the family was, but how resourceful the family was. And that's typical of our 19th century in terms of gathering nuts and honeys and going out and knowing what the local produce was and harvesting and canning, all those things that a farm family would take for granted. And Jean, who transcribed all of Louise's tales and stories, in our first published book, Memories of Millbrook, has excerpted some of the articles about this house and property. So, Deep Hollow, you understand that. The houses that are on it, the earliest farms, you have a sense of what they were like. If you look at this building, it's been changed a great deal, but we're looking basically at a very modest early 19th century. Some of it could be earlier than that, but ballpark, early 19th century, story and a half house. And that's very typical, a lot of farmhouses in the area. The photograph that we have of the house from Louise's day shows it really as a hard-scrabble farm. It didn't have all the wonderful embellishments and details and doorways and additions that you see now. That took another generation, and that was the Donaldson family, John Wilcox Donaldson, and I know some of you have connections and memories of that. It's nice to think that Mr. Donaldson was the breadwinner in the family, and he did well, but it was really his wife. And the wife's name, you know? DuPont. Yes, DuPont. And it's the DuPont connection that caused the extension to be built, the barns, and the other outsections. A few years ago, the Preservation League of New York State and the National Trust for Historic Preservation had a very special weekend tour, architectural tour. And a number of family members, DuPonts and Vanderbilts and all, came on that tour. And I was privileged to be one of the tour guides. Mario Bullata, some of you may know the name as a decorator, some high-profile chintz, he introduced chintz, was on that tour. And of all the houses we saw, and we saw a lot of impressive, oversized homes in that weekend. Of all the houses, this was his favorite. And he said, he makes pronouncements because of sort of his ego, but he declared that the end room is by far the most beautiful room in all of Dutchess County. And the reason for that is proportion, which is what it's all about. The room is really perfect. That's sort of a 1930s, 1940s perfection, by the way, but it's still a beautiful, beautiful room. So that's sort of my overview on it. Many of you know the house because of the Bucos tenure, and they had it for a number of years. They also had the Christmas tree farm. But now, the real core is Louise Tompkins. So what we thought we'd do, we're going to take a short walk down the road. We're going to look at some of the property for it, and some of the details, and Jean has recollections that Louise wrote that we'll hear about. Then we'll come back, and we'll be able to have our lemonade and our cookies and whatever.
David, I didn't even introduce you as our town historian and village historian. But I also would like to introduce the host. This is Salander. Whatever. And the root cellar. Why don't we do that first?
Okay. I'm flexible.
You're also welcome.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
And before we get up, though, I wondered if Henry could tell us a little bit about what it was like when the Donaldsons were here, which was another stage in its existence.
Yes.
But Dave brought up something very interesting, talking about that room. You know why that room was built, or what that room was? That was Mr. Donaldson's office. And he was a kind of a tall fella, and wonderful guy. He would never sit. And as I would work out here in the gardens or in the garage and around the cars and that, I always look there, and he's always bending over his desk, and he would never sit. And he was a fast man. He was fast moving. He was kind of a nervous fellow, but he was always really fast. But that was his office, that oval glass thing there, and he had a desk right smack against that glass oval. But I said, I don't even think he had a chair there. I really don't. He always stood. He did all his paperwork and everything was by standing. Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about being a chauffeur for two different cars?
Oh, yeah. Well, Mrs. Donaldson, as you all know, was a DuPont. Her car, they had three cars in the garage. Her car was a Volkswagen Bug. And they had an apartment in Hotel Pierre on 5th Avenue, 61st Street. And I used to take him down on Tuesdays and pick him up on Thursdays. He had a seat on the stock market, so for 2 days or 3 days. But I took her down, it'd be in the Volkswagen, the Bug, and I had to go down Sawmill River Parkway and into the pier that way. Took him down. He had a Jaguar. And it'd take him down in the 5 speeds ahead and all that. And he had to go down Riverside Drive. A lot of traffic, you know, in and out, you know, in his big Jaguar. And for us to run the errands and that whatnot, we had, at that first one was a Chevy station wagon, and we traded that in and got an Opel. Then after that, we traded that in and got the Chrysler. Oh, what was that? They don't even make them anymore now. It was made by Chrysler at that time. Valiant. The little Chrysler Valiant. And that was our runaround for around here.
An interesting connection, DuPont connection, is that Mr. Donaldson also translated Mort d'Arthur, which is a pretty famous sort of medieval pageant, and it was illustrated by Andrew Wyatt, and it was published in 1943. Now, at first that seems wow, until you realize Andrew Wyatt, Chad's Ford, DuPont, Winter Tour, it's all the background of Mrs. DuPont. So it was her connection that got him to illustrate her husband's writings. But was published in 1943.
I don't know if anybody knew that Mr. Donaldson was the main man that was going to restructure the village of Millbrook. I have the book home yet. I don't know if anybody's seen it or not. Where he had all the blueprints.
Yes, 48 was it?
1945.
45.
Right after the war,
Yeah.
he had to plan the village green as it's today. And it was a fight, believe it or not, it was a fight between the Thorne family and the Donaldsons. And I can remember this just like it was yesterday. And that plan was presented to the community. And the Thorne family says, no, we don't want anything like that. The Donaldsons wanted to see a big community building built on that village green that would be used by everybody, like our firehouses today, or something in that nature. And Thorne said, no, we don't want anything like that, just put the green in there. And it was taken to by the village trustees, and at that time, they rejected Donaldson's, and Donaldson's never did another thing for the village again or anything. They spent big dollars. As Henry said, he still got the book, and it was absolutely fantastic. What was interesting also, the fact is they had made point with the highway department to take and make the road a 4-lane highway past the village of Millbrook, going up by the Millbrook Water Tower and coming out on Diedrich's corner.
That's what we should have had.
That's right, Ginny. Ginny, that is right. What did the state highway department do? They said, okay, you guys didn't want it, we'll build you 44A and make that the highway. So now every third car that comes from Sharon bypasses Millbrook, and the fourth car comes into the village of Millbrook. And every businessman loses a little bit of that money.
And all the big
And I can
trucks
tell you that
wanna go
because
on
I
82
know
come
from...
right to the village.
Huh?
The trucks that want to
Oh, and
go
all
on
those
82
trucks,
south, they gotta go to the
absolutely
village.
right. Stanley, they had that plan, 4 lanes to go, and that whole thing, and that just squashed it. I'll never forget that because I think that was one of the biggest faults that Millbrook
And that's
ever
the joy
made.
of local history, you see. We could keep going, talking about it. I think what we'll do now, though, with Ginny's permission, is we'll look inside the house, we'll take a walk, then we'll come back and have our lemonade, and we'll be able to explore and ask questions. Okay, sound good? Okay. Okay, Ginny, shall we look at...
Lily's gonna lead us.
Okay, wonderful.
That room, and then out again and around, whatever you want.
Yeah, okay. I guess we'll go down to the library first. Okay. And then we can double back to the fireplace.
Why don't we have, this half go in first.
Do you mind if I paper clip?
Oh my gosh, I'm not going to say anything.
I'm the official tape recorder.
I know, I don't mind. There's my baby.
Oh, God, look at that.
I can talk about him a lot.
Oh, look at that. What a doll.
That's Samuel.
Hi, Samuel.
Well, pretty good.
He's shy.
Hi, Samuel. Hi. All these people are coming. He's a husky, Mike. Oh, they did this.
Take him home.
Where do all these people come
The
in?
library is this way.
This way?
Okay, go ahead. Right here.
There's a step up there too.
Oh, I like this stairwell. I've never seen something like. Is that the original?
That was, I think, Donaldson's put that in. That was originally
Oh,
the perfect room.
isn't this lovely? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's all.
The paneling, it really is a library, isn't it? Yeah. With all the beautiful wood paneling and all the bookshelves.
Study.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Beautiful wood.
Yes, yes.
And this is the room that Mary O'Gallata said was so perfect. The proportion, the details. For those of you who know the DuPont family, Rene DuPont's cousin, I believe it was Henry Francis DuPont. And from the 1930s on, he collected rooms and woodwork from mansions all over New England and the central states, put them together in his own house, which is called Winter Tour. It's about 130 rooms now. What he would do, though, in order to adjust the rooms to fit the existing rooms in that mansion, he may need more paneling or an extra piece to stretch things out. So he had a full-time staff of the best craftsmen and cabinet makers. Many of them had learned their trade at Williamsburg, the restoration in Virginia. So Mr. DuPont worked with Rene, and the details that you're looking at were all created by those craftsmen who actually did the work at the main Winter Tour house. And that's one of the reasons it's such an extraordinary layout, and the proportion is so great. It really is a beautiful, beautiful room.
What was the name of Mrs. DuPont?
Rene
Renee,
DuPont.
the one that lived here?
Yes, Rene DuPont Donaldson.
Yes.
And it really was her family connection with it. The DuPonts, by the way, the stipulation, this is, some of you know Brewster Beach. Brewster Beach is a retired vicar from St. Peter's. His first wife was actually a DuPont. And the DuPont Trust was set up with lots and lots of property. Any DuPont could continue to live on the DuPont estate complex. But the stipulation was, any DuPont who lived there had to have a dog. Didn't say anything about children, spouses, or anything else. But if you wanted to live on the property, you had to have a dog. That was the DuPont connection. And to this day, that's the stipulation. So every single DuPont who's there has at least one dog.
David,
Yes.
question. Now, the Donaldsons, are they related to the Donaldsons that were in Millbrook earlier?
No relation with that Donaldson.
Okay.
But they're both, there's John W. Donaldson, this one, and the other is John, I think it's John D. Donaldson, who was the bank president in 1891. No relation.
What DuPont, which DuPont was Mrs. Donaldson?
Coleman.
And
Her
right,
father's name was Coleman. Her DuPont.
and were they one who, they were right down at Winter on, they were...
The DuPont families, yeah, the DuPonts had started in the 1830s. They were a Swiss family, actually, and their fame came from dynamite, and coming with a refined kind of dynamite for guns and ammunitions. Unfortunately, the first head of that family blew himself up in the factory. So from that point on, the DuPonts made sure that they didn't live at the same site that they made dynamite. But that's why so much property was being owned by them, because they had thousands of acres.
Well, they started Longwood, one of them started Longwood.
Yeah, that's another cousin, Longwood Garden.
And that's what I'm wondering.
Where was that fire?
That was the actual explosion. Is the factory now where the explosion was. For any of you who travel or know the historic sites, there's actually a museum of industry that the DuPont family has, and it traces things like dynamite and all the other technology that made this country so famous. The name Winter Tour, by the way, is named after the village in Switzerland that the DuPonts came from, and it would have been Winter Tour, and they corrupted it, so it's Winter, the way you say in English, and Tour, the way you say it in Swiss, so Winter Tour. Sometimes it looks like Winter Thor,
Yes.
but it's really Winter Tour.
You know, interesting thing is just about 3 or 4 months ago, they had on Biography, they had the DuPont family on there, and I happened to be watching.
Oh, it's very extensive. Well, we're fortunate enough that this is a product of that combination, and it really does touch on a lot of aspects of history.
So David, again for me, when was this room added? With the Donaldsons?
The Donaldsons were doing it, I'm not sure when, in the 30s. I know that...
The plans, I have the original plans, I think they had 32.
32.
The plans, but I don't know when they actually
Okay.
Okay.
So that would have been it.
Yeah.
I have heard that when the Donaldsons were looking at property, and that's what they really wanted this piece for, the first time that Mrs. Donaldson stepped into the hallway, the floor gave way. So the house was in very, very poor condition. I think it had been empty actually before they bought it. So the work that was done here is really quite extensive. And of course the barns are extraordinary that were added on.
The Donaldsons did all that work.
Yeah, they oversaw.
Did they have horses, or the barns were for the
Henry?
cattle?
He had horses. He had horses. He was in the riding hunt club. But Mrs. Peabody, you know where her place is. His horse was always kept at over Peabody's. And that's the first thing he did in the morning. He'd get in his Jaguar and go over there and ride his horse. And Mrs. Donaldson would go down here and at 6 o'clock in the morning jump in the pool. Spring fed. Nude.
I heard that, it's true.
Is that a tradition that goes with the family?
It's very private.
But she'd come back then. She'd come back, dry off, and come back and crawl back into bed. And then she'd lay there in bed and have her breakfast in bed. And she told me one time her biggest fear was to wake up some morning that she would have to get out and get her own breakfast. She had a live-in cook and a live-in, they had their secretary right top of that spiral staircase.
Right.
That was the office for her, but his was right there. But she was, but she had her breakfast every morning in bed.
How long did the Donaldsons live there?
I have no idea, a long time, a lot of years. Yeah. I can tell you one more. Like a lot of married couples, they got into a real bad squabble. And he wanted a divorce, and she said, no way. She was not getting a divorce. And over in here, up in the woods, there's a little cabin or something. Did you ever see it? It's up in there. Well, he built this little cabin, and that's where he stayed. And that was sort of a separation back then. And until they made amends, like everything got all right and just kept on going again. But the old cabin got closed down. But that's right up here in the woods. But that's he had that built. Well, she had it built. That's where he in the doghouse.
Another aside about Deep Hollow, which is kind of fun. 1903, 1904, Oakley Thorne started purchasing, actually a little before that, but purchasing a lot of property running along what we now think of as Tamarack. He actually amassed that property and used it as his Adirondack lodge. At the time, 1890s through the World War I, a lot of wealthy families had estates up in the Adirondacks and would go there for the season. It would be very rustic, you can imagine, oversized log cabins and rustic furniture and hard life. You know, you'd go up with your servants. And, anyway, what Oakley did, which is really wonderful, was he created his own rustic camp, which is the ancestor to what Tamarack is now, and put the dams in. But to get to that, it's actually just down the road here. And he would have his house guests at Thorndale, and they would come out by carriage along the road, go through that, get to the pond edge, and then they'd take their boats across the pond and have the picnics in what was the boathouse, if you will, or pond house. Some of you may remember that. And now it's part of the Bonnecue property, and a lot of people know it in that context. But that was his Adirondack retreat. So you have the Thornes coming by this house virtually every day when Louise Tompkins lived here with her grandparents and knowing her.
David, shall we
Yes.
move on to...
Yes, and Ginny's keeping us to our task. So
Was there anybody before the Tompkins family in the house?
yeah, Ginny can tell you the earlier names of who owned it.
Not in the book, that's
No, she remembered it's the Tompkins, but Louise's, Ginny's done research on who owned it.
Well, I know
In the 1860s.
Admiring his fine work.
you've got the vines in the house.
That took time.
Yeah, every bit of it, the interlacing, but
Plus, he's got to get the
This is all absolutely perfect.
It is.
The core of the building could, depending on the references for it, might be as early as the 1780s, 1790s. We know for sure from the 1820s, 1830s that this was an active farm. Details before that and how much of the structure is from an earlier time, we're not sure because it evolved so, as did many of the houses. We're going to be looking at there's a cave. Okay, I'll call it a cave. It could have been a root cellar. Depending on the books you read, and some of you may recall, in the 1970s there was a book published that the root cellars that we all took for granted were actually Viking, and they predated Christopher Columbus by 400 years. And you march right from New York City all the way up to Albany, and it's very distinctive the way these root cellars are being made in terms of the capstones and details. And it just so happens that the closest examples to those are in Iceland, so as opposed to anywhere else in it. So there's this supposition that the Vikings were here first. So anyway, it's nice to know that. But that's why we're going to look at it. We're going to assume that it's a root cellar and that was actually built at the time of the earliest house, but it may predate it.
Oh, interesting. Can we go right on out?
Yeah, probably through these doors is the best way.
I'm sorry. I did get out of point when you started talking, but over there where it has a metal tub set in, how early do you think that is? Would that have been here when Louise was here?
Oh yeah, that would
100 years
definitely,
ago?
yeah. The metal tubs set in like that, baking units. We have Rumford stoves happening in the 1780s, 1790s. And from that point on, we have examples of that that were actually built in.
It has wood in it right now, but underneath is a little firebox looking.
Thank you, Henry.
We did a lot of different kitchens. Yeah, the kitchen was in 3 rooms, and we combined it to one and removed the back door and cut that big sort of lantern over the table. Yeah, the kitchen was the biggest change, and then upstairs was in 3 discrete plates.
That only seemed like the dining room kitchen.
Dining room we didn't do much. We
And the
we raised
linoleum,
ceiling.
the inset linoleum.
We took that.
Yeah.
Which I actually liked the linoleum, but
Never forgot.
we thought we would take our chances with the mud.
No,
Dining room we didn't change it, we just raised the ceiling, and we found it already plastered up there, so the Donaldsons obviously had it that way.
Come pick it up.
well, you want to get close to him. Thank you.
Pretty disgusting.
That's okay. Remember, this is the historical society.
Right? We never used it, so.
Great, thank you.
Wow.
Up here, it's very cool in there. I'll give it that much.
Sure.
You're welcome to walk inside it if you like.
Oh, it's lovely in here. Ooh. Oh, it is. It's wonderful.
That's a root cell.
Yeah.
Yeah, the root cell was always on the third floor. Had that fluorescent light in there. And,
The original fluorescent light.
yeah, right, that's a Viking.
It's a Viking fluorescent light.
Little switch, or they get electrocuted because it's a wet floor.
I thought everybody was going to get in there at once.
Well, they could. They could. It's big enough. It's wonderful in there. So nice and cool.
Onions and what else you got?
Some carrots and some potatoes.
Into the house.
Dave, one of the things you might mention is during the summertime, they used to use this to keep things. They would buy ice and take it and chunk it in there.
And keep it cool.
Yeah, that was the only, it was a way of using it.
And in the winter too, it would be.
Yeah, in the winter time, in the winter time, they would
They go back out and around 3, they quit and have
Well, it was completely flat and in rubble, and we thought this probably was a tennis court. That's why we thought of it, and so we put it back.
I'll be darned. Yeah.
It's
It is.
pretty
It's
up
right in the
there.
same spot.
It's in the same
I think
spot.
I see the green fence there.
Yep. It was just so logical. It was flat and
Yeah.
it was the right size, and we said this has to have been a tennis court.
Yeah.
That's how we got the idea.
She played there every morning, all day long with this professional time.
Your grandfather walked in standing up.
Well, I'm terrible, so I don't. I took lessons last year. This year I'm missing.
Now, did you put the skylight in? No. Did you put the skylight in over the dining? We did. That's lovely. What a lovely addition. Thanks so much. And did you put the little, the railing around in one of the rooms, there's a skylight coming down.
Right. Oh, and a railing, yes. We did that.
What a clever idea.
It was a little dark, and they called it a sport room on the original plans, and it was sort of utilitarian. I think probably used the front door as the front door, and this is maybe where they came in after riding or something. But we sort of use this now as the front door, and we needed a little bit more light. And
What a clever idea.
thank you. Gee, that's so nice to hear.
And then you put with the railing around, it looks so charming too.
Yeah, and the skylight just
And the children can't fall through.
and they can't fall through, although sometimes it's not a bad idea.
You don't own all the way down to the Bates, the old Bates Club.
No, I don't think I can find that. I think I noticed we stopped on the other side of it. I sold a little
That's up there. I just want to check with you.
David, this archway here connected to the fireplace? Yeah, yeah. But it kind of looks like a flying buttress. That's what I was going to say.
There's a lot of architectural whimsy. That's one of them because it creates a doorway. Did they have to do that? No. Does it look great? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with the barns. They sort of, they're massaging the landscape.
Yeah.
And the other
It's lovely.
thing is in those old foundations of the fireplaces,
Right.
Yeah, a little bit touchy. Nowadays the code says you got to go so deep.
I thought it was up here.
Julie doesn't look quite what it is.
Okay.
The cistern?
I called it that because I didn't know what else
Let's
to
go
call
up and look at it.
Okay.
Because it's great. I think the cistern is very, very important. It's an important part of the house.
We're going up to look at a cistern. We'll take a little step.
I didn't want to live there.
When I go out,
and all these special. Well, I see a lot of little touches, not just the plantings, but like the two little steps, the stone steps.
Oh, yeah. Oh, little things
And
that are wonderful.
Up through here, I realized. We were here for like 2 years, and I realized there's stone stairs going straight up there.
I love to
have to read more often. And back in the woods, there's another. Oh, if you go straight back, there's another. They're just the sweetest little. But
You don't have time.
Every summer I say, this is my summer, and this is my fourth baby, so I'm usually pregnant or nursing or.
I've been saying it for 9 years. I only have 2. It has gotten better, I have to say. Now I don't have so much of an excuse that, I have to have my hands on one child.
Right.
Or something, but now they're just busy doing other things that I have to.
Would you ever use a leash?
You know what I used once was for Lawton, we went on Scott's father's boat one weekend, and I didn't have one of those harnesses, and he was only about 1.5 or something, so I put my horse's halter on him. That worked very well. Lead rope, it was great. When I got back, my sister-in-law gave me a swimming, whatever it's called.
Now, Frank, what do you think it is?
Isn't it cistern?
A cistern collects water and deposits it.
But this had, when we looked in, I don't know if you've seen it, there was Water City.
Yeah. But what I'm saying is a cistern normally is attributed to a collection feature and then a deposition, unless some building was here collecting it, but I doubt.
See, I have a feeling, gut reaction, I could be wrong, but you've got the water coming down from the hill.
Right.
It's being collected here. You've also got the pond.
Exactly,
And I have a feeling that it's water that
is
natural reserve to keep the pond.
Yeah.
Down there with the swamp.
Where the swimming pool is.
You can see, right down
Oh,
there.
I know.
Okay.
So that's the water source.
So it was probably built by the Donaldsons, because I pictured pipes going to the house from some sort.
I can't imagine the Tompkins or any of the other farmers doing something as elaborate as that. I have a feeling it's getting the water from the hill, having it collected here, using it for the outbuildings and the animals and the house, but also to give water for the swimming pool.
Julie, I'll let David tell Julie, would you?
Swimming pool water
Yeah.
all came across
From that
top of the
side?
mountain.
Okay.
Where did the water come
underneath
from?
the road.
Okay.
You heard about the water coming from?
I did, and we're the ones guilty of stopping all that.
There was,
The water was ice cold, and I was just saying that the algae would grow on the bottom in 2 days. We'd clean it, and then algae would grow back within 2 days, and it would be very slick
Yeah.
to stand on, and sort of uninviting. And you couldn't treat it with chemicals because it flowed out the other end.
Oh.
So ultimately, we decided to convert it to a heated river. But the stonework is original, well, from the Donaldson time, and that's crumbling, and that needs to be begun.
Well, David thought maybe this was to collect water to send down to the pool when they first built it. I had thought it was earlier than that, and they used it to go down to the house.
And it could be the house, because normally what would happen, a lot of the states in the 19th century, late 19th century have it, where it's collected from water sources up on the hill, brought down, collected in one area, and then from here it could feed a variety of the outbuildings. It could be the horses, could be the animals. Rather than digging separate wells for each of those buildings, you'd have it collected. I suspect that's what this is, collection point.
See, that's the same thing they did in Thorndale. They took and put the reservoir way up on top of the hill.
to get head pressure down to
And
feed the
then
highest
gravity
point.
fed. All the houses and all the barns were all fed by that big tower on the hill.
Except when it froze in the wintertime.
No,
It never freezes.
Never froze. Well, that's the crazy thing about it, you know. It had a roof over it. And that came right down to the ground. It was all enclosed.
We had a cistern in our barn when I was growing up, and that goes slightly uphill to the house, and we had a pump in our basement.
Oh, to bring
In the one room nearest the barn.
So I suspect that's what it was.
And it didn't freeze, I guess.
Well, David, you're going to get your lemonade so we can have a little drink before we walk down the road and back?
Sure, why don't we go have lemonade? I think people would appreciate sitting for a minute. Okay.
It's a cozy place.
Yeah, I mean, not just the layout, but what you've done and what you've put in.
Well, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
We'll have to get you over to ours
The
sometime.
older trees. You know, you haven't come in and
No, well, it's
you're
it's
living
beautiful
with the
what has been
property.
done, and I don't know much about landscaping. And that
Yes,
sort
you
of
do.
thing,
Yes, you do. What you've done
so.
here
I haven't
is-
really. We mow, and that's about it.
But that's
Hope
a
for the
form of
best.
landscape.
Yeah,
That's a good landscaping.
Yeah.
I mean, that
yeah,
is,
it looks very
that's
natural.
allowing the earth to tell you.
Really.
He planted more wildflowers than anybody in the United States. He had them come from all over the country. Wildflowers. That was
Mrs. DuPont?
Mrs. Donaldson.
Donaldson, which was a DuPont, yeah.
He said to me, Henry, first thing I want you to do is take the tractor and go up top of the mountain and go up to the spring house and turn the water off to the pool. I said, okay.
I know what you found up there.
You betcha. There was this dead woodchuck or rabbit pushed right up against that screen.
Same thing down the
The
farm.
water was so good.
It's perfect. Same thing down there. I had to
Got a
spring
lot
up
of
the hill.
protein in it, right?
Oh,
gosh.
Didn't play out. So he was in there.
Before it gives it a flavor. I never forgot that. That water was so good.
That house has so much charm.
Oh, doesn't it?
That's lovely.
Interesting, all the stairways.
And in here.
Yes,
The different configuration.
right.
I love French doors.
Oh, I do too. Yeah.
Makes it so nice and bright.
Yes.
That'd be so huge.
Look at all the fireplaces around.
History Channel March. I've seen a show on lumbering out in
Get that aroma again of that white, whatever that is unbelievable.
one time.
How long does it take one to know all this long?
You have to ask Rich, because he's our caretaker and he's the one that does it.
Like a jump.
I'd rather not know.
By the time you get to the other, it's time to start
Yeah. But it's not year-round at least.
Louise mentioned this row of pine trees, and she said on the other side was an area she called the jungle. It was filled with stuff, and I guess a couple of chicken houses. She always encouraged me to notice.
How long have you been here?
5 years.
Yeah, probably.
Do you know the name of the trees across the road that are blooming?
You know, I do not, and I just was like, this year,
Somebody put.
No, they're very prolific this year. They really
I
are.
honestly don't think I've noticed them before. I think this is the first year since we bought the place that they've bloomed.
Yeah, all
And
over the county
I
they're
have no
blooming.
idea. I have no idea what they're called.
I don't either, and
And the
nobody that
aroma
I've
is
talked.
so wonderful.
It's like honeysuckle and mock orange together, isn't it? The pond is
Very nice, yeah.
Did you divert the flow? Now you converted it.
Right.
But you did divert the flow, you didn't impede it at all?
I don't know. I'm sure it was done properly.
No,
But I don't know.
I'm sure.
I
I'm sure it was.
I don't. My husband dealt with it, and I don't know how.
Because it's great. A nice natural flow is always good to maintain,
Yeah.
you know, really.
Right, and I don't know.
Then what
I
acted
don't
on
know
that?
what they did.
Yeah.
Now, is that the pond that Louise refers to in her stories and all? Yeah. Because that's your property across the road too, also.
In fact, most of our property is.
Oh, all right. Okay. Wow. Oh, such charm.
I have a little sort of snack shack.
I'm sorry, Fussy. You certainly have done a beautiful, beautiful job there.
Really, we haven't done much, but we just sort of let nature take its
Well,
course.
you've enhanced it, you know, and you didn't come in and really change it drastically, which is nice. And the changes that you did make were, you know, coming in, I would say, oh, that was a change because it's not evident. And sometimes when people go in and they may change things, it's a wow, that was an afterthought.
Well, if you buy an old house, I think you should really want an old house,
right.
Because they're so wonderful,
Yeah.
and you can't replicate an
No,
old house.
no.
It's just
It has a charm that you cannot build into it.
No, and so I don't know why anybody would want to change it.
Yeah.
If they, the upstairs was in 3 sections, so that was a problem with the small children.
Mm-hmm.
So we did combine it, but I think that was probably the biggest change for me. The Donaldsons had the center section, so there's 3 staircases, and the center section was for the help. And that's why they had it separate. And it just, not for a family.
No,
you can't.
no, not with little children.
Right. So the master bedroom was over at the library that we saw, and so we would have to go down the stairs, through the downstairs, up to get to the kids, then down to get back to our.
Okay, yeah. There was no connecting.
That was not going to happen.
No.
So we combined it upstairs.
Yeah, very good. That was a very wise idea.
Not meant for a family.
No. So, well, thank you so much.
With my condition, I'm always going. I'll be back.
Come back and you can, another day you can walk down the road and back. The barn used to be on the other side of the road. The spring house used to be down 1/4 mile next to the little stream. But we'd go in our cars back to St. Peter's, see if it stops. If it stops raining, then go on to the cemetery, because we were going to get there about 4:30 anyway. We can go right on to the cemetery. And so let's meet at St. Peter's.
Yeah, I think that's a good plan.
Okay, now the story.
Everybody always looking for at Christmas time for Christmas bonuses. Mrs. Donaldson, 2 pop, lots of money. Here we were working. But she went off to Japan, him and her, and before she left, she says, Henry, she says, here's your Christmas bonus.
Henry, a little louder. Sorry, we could hear.
She says, Henry, here's your Christmas bonus. Before I leave, here's your Christmas bonus. A nice Christmas card. Christmas bonus. She left. I opened it up. What do you suppose was in it? $1. So we were living over here. They went to Japan. That spring they came home. And I said, I'll fix her. the first thing, and she was kind of brazen. She'd walk in there, and if any of you ladies, as you remember when you were brides, you didn't want nobody to tell you how to set up your house. She'd walk in that apartment over there and say, Ann, I don't like that couch over there. You ought to put the couch over there and put that chair over there and put the table over there. And poor Ann, she'd go bonkers. But anyhow, when she did that, I said, by the way, Mrs. Donaldson, you see what I did with your Christmas bonus? I put it right up there. And I had it in the picture frame. You know what she says to me? Just think, Henry, when you're here as long as Louis, you'll get 40 of them. Louis Christopher, some of you know him, Joe Christopher's father, he worked for the DuPonts down Terrytown, and then when Donaldson's came here, he continued working here with him. He was the head gardener, old Louis, and he worked for her 42 years, but that time it was 40 years. And that's what she was saying. When you work for me for 40 years, you'll get $40, 40 of them. Wow. $1 for each year that you work, and that's what she gave you for Christmas.
Well, Henry, I worked for IBM for 34 years. And my Christmas bonus was?
Zip.
We didn't get bonuses.
Now a lot of guys are getting zipped.
You got $1. 84 shares of DuPont stock.
Yes, that's right. He's not telling us about that. Wasn't that tuna fish great?
Did you get the thunder?
Yes, I did. I got to find out who's Bill.
Johnny Miller was the boss.
Ginny said we'll put some lime juice in that.
Oh,
That was delicious. Delicious. We walked down the
you know,
I don't know. I wouldn't know that one.
Did I want to say Craig House? Is there? No, that's not
Hey, that's a children's house.
Yeah, down below Beacon, down that way.
It was a Craig house, and I don't know whether
Is there a Craig?
there is a Craig house, and I don't know what originally was, but for a while it was for right. It was a rich person's estate, and then for a while it was for people with emotional problems, but now it's not longer that. So I guess this probably has changed its.
And he went and lived in Connecticut.
Really?
She lived down there, and he lived in Connecticut.
Now, you said that it was Joe Christopher's father was the head gardener there? And his name was what? Louis. And you said he worked for them for 42 years. Does that include the time?
That was 42 years when I left here. He worked after that, yeah. He probably worked another 3 or 4 years.
After that?
Maybe 5 years after I left.
And when did you start working here, Henry?
Around 1956, 57, along in there.
Okay.
Yeah. And then when I left here, I went to Central Hudson. I worked at Central Hudson 35 years.
And how long did you work here?
Around 4 years.
4 years.
About his
Did
youth.
you end up with the $4? Did you end up with $4?
Yeah.
Did she ever give you a reason why giving you a $1 bonus?
Terrible.
No.
Is that right?
And now he lives here.
Never gave a reason.
To think he lived in that completely different culture and time.
Yeah, I know. It's tremendous.
One time when
A tremendous adjustment.
Janice was pregnant.
And they made
The house, which is right next to the church now, to use as a parsonage vicarage, if you will, for the priest, traveling priest. And that was originally a Haviland house. When this church burned down, Mr. Vandenberg, who owned the property across the street and the property where the current church is, gave that parcel to the congregation so that the new church could be built right next to the vicarage parsonage.
Oh, very good. So, and that was when, did you say? 1880, St. Peter's Church. Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Okay. David said that Mrs. Donaldson, when you were working there, would give you a monthly check to pay the expenses of the...
Just to run the house.
Just to run the house.
That's to buy the groceries. And it was my paycheck, Kitty's. Kitty was a maid that lived in.
Okay.
And then there was Fanny. She was a live-in cook. She was from Germany. And, of course, there was Louis Christopher. And then there was Al Bandry. He was a Greek, and he was also a gardener. So she had two gardeners, and she had me as a chauffeur mechanic. But I worked in the gardens too. And she would give me a check, $15,000. Back then, that was a lot of money.
Now, this is in what year?
1957, 58. And she'd give me that check, and it came out of Terrytown. That's where that's where the DuPonts have all their money. And I had to take it to Millbrook Bank, and that ran this house just to buy the groceries and pay those couple of salaries every month.
15,000.
15,000. And don't forget, they had a full-time apartment, a full apartment in the Hotel Pierre on Fifth Avenue and 61st Street, and that cost them big bucks. But they had a lot. They were in the back then. They were in the 80% income tax bracket back then. She would buy brand new shoes and wear them maybe for a month or two, and she'd take and tell me to take those shoes over to Sharon. At that time, it was run by the church, the Bargain Box.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if it's still there or not, but back then it was called the Bargain Box. And I always had to get a receipt. She belonged to all kinds of book clubs. She would get the books, and she'd give them to me, and she'd take them down to Millbrook Public Library. Be sure you get a receipt. It was all for taxes. For taxes, yep.
Isn't that something?
Yep.
Well, thank you. That was interesting to have that on the tape.
Oh.
And Kurt, being Kurt, said, "Louise, don't worry about it."
Oh, so Hilda's buried
Hilda's
here too. Oh.
So what do you think, David?
I think it's
Very
wonderful.
nice.
Absolutely
So
wonderful.
this little stone, the little flat one, was the original stone?
But they polished and cleaned it up.
It did look like that?
And added her death date? Yeah?
Well, it wasn't quite that bad.
Oh, it wasn't like that?
It was more like this.
No.
Right.
No, it's not that long ago.
We had a cement base put under it.
Wonderful.
Okay.
And,
Oh, great.
because it was
That's a good
sinking.
idea.
Now, where are our grandparents then?
This is Grandma right here.
Oh, really?
And she's facing this way, and Grandpa's facing that way.
Oh, really?
Why?
So this is Louise's,
Oh, I don't think that was it.
Louisa Cutler Hale. Louisa Cutler Hale, 1851, 1949.
That's staying, that's not going.
No. William D. Hale, 1851 to 1921.
Jean who's done so much work, has some stories to say, but she'll also explain the relationship of the Hales and the Tompkins and why the site is here. So, Jean, it's all yours.
Okay, well, I think most of you who read the book knew that Louise grew up with her grandmother and grandfather Hale. Her mother died when she was 2, and her brother was just a baby. And her grandparents died, her Tompkins grandparents died just soon after. And it was just too much for her father to run a farm and take care of 2 small children. And so luckily Grandma and Grandpa Hale, who turned out to be the saving of Louise, took her in, and once in a while they had Billy too. And so she owed a great deal to her family, her Hale family, for her life as it became, and for all the wonderful things that she learned from her family. So we're not sure. Louise's stone only had the birth date on it, and it didn't have anything else. So we think that when Grandma Hale had her stones all put together, she did one for Louise, knowing Louise's circumstances at that time. And that's why it didn't have a death date, because I'm sure Louise just didn't have any funds left. And so then we came along, and with the help of Louise's stories, we were able to upgrade it. Now I'd like to put in front of the historical, I don't even have Ginny's permission, but I'd just like to say, I think now something should be done with Grandma and Grandpa Hale's stones, because they did so much for her. You know, at least having them cleaned, because Louise's stones look so very nice, and I think that...
And Grandma's stone is sinking.
Yeah, we had to put Louise's on a cement base, because it was sinking also.
Yeah.
I've got a question. Why is her stone facing this way and this is facing that way? Is there a reason?
We're not sure.
Yeah, where's Louise? Here.
Louise is here.
She's
Her friend Hilda.
I mean
Oh,
here.
probably
over there.
here.
I think.
Well, probably.
Some people said you should face the east.
Well, this is so loose, anybody could have.
I know, when we were here,
Oh,
when I
okay.
showed Harold this, he said, I could turn this around, and he started to pick it up, and oh no, don't do anything yet. Can we find out? But I'm really very pleased with
Oh, it looks
what we've done
lovely.
with the book, and I'd like to thank you all for buying the book, and if you haven't got a book and you like one, and I bring this up to the kids at school all the time, how no matter what your situation is, you can still do something for the good of your fellow man, and she's a good example. No.
Can I get everybody to stand right in here and take a quick picture of this thing finish off the real fast?
It could be, before you do that, John, John, before you,
It's going to happen. So.
can I get, I don't want to get in front of you there.
Yeah, we have to double up. A short piece.
I'm sorry, you should have done this before we ate.
Short people in front all the time.
All right, that's a good idea.
Now, wait a minute, you got something in your hair. There.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Bless you. All right. Wait a minute,
John,
don't
get you in the picture, John.
I want to say something about you. Tell me two conclusions. I immediately jumped to the conclusion since Louise's mother was a cutler. Maud? No.
Her grandmother was a cutler.
Grandmother was a cutler. And she's right here with Mordecai Cutler's tombstone. So I assumed he must have been her father. And when I started looking into it, I found Mordecai never married. I still haven't found out who his father was.
Never can tell. It's a photo op.
I joke to get you to smile.
Okay, great. Okay?
Go one more.
Wait, John, you want to get in the picture? Let somebody...
You're absolutely amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
Get up and get down. That's more than I can do.
Stand right down here with Frank. Frank's my biggest. Oh, I don't want to get in front of you, though. Okay, let's go.
Cheese.
Cheese, great.
Thank you.
I think that's the last picture, too.
Now it's a second.
To get on my Actually,
All the sackets, that's one of the earliest
Tombstone was
families.
Bob
Fitch,
King's idea.
Sackett, all the
So
names.
thank you.
Oh, it's very, very nice. Very nice
He
idea.
said, let's put it on an upright position, because we were going to do it flat, remember?
We were going to raise her
Connections,
stone
how things happen.
and put it along the front, but this is a much nicer thing.
Much
It
nicer,
is.
much nicer. Yeah,
You know.
yeah, yeah.
And the plaque is so
Yes,
shows up so
right,
beautiful.
yeah. And could, Jean, could you just say a little bit more about Hilda? Because I remember Hilda was a resident at the infirmary with...
I'm not sure too much about her, although I do know that she was sort of like Louise's legs, and she
Yeah,
She did a lot of leg work because when Louise was still writing, she was able to do it mentally, but not physically.
physically,
And Hilda Bauer was...
yeah.
very
And Hilda's
practical.
room was across the hall from
Yeah, yeah.
Louise's,
At the
yeah.
county
At the county infirmary.
And when Hilda died, Louise was so concerned because Hilda had no family at all. So she talked to Curdy, who was the warden of the cemetery, and said, Curdy, is there any way that Hilda can be buried in the cemetery? And Kurt, being Kurt, said, now Louise, don't worry about it. I'll take care of her. I'll take her. And that was it. So that's why she's
Good
here.
for him.
Yeah, it's good.
That's great.
My brother tells a story of when he was a freshman in college. Now, Georgie now is 60, so freshman in college would be that many years ago. And he was working for Safari, and they were putting the addition on the county infirmary. So there was a whole bunch of construction kids being laborers from college. And he said every lunchtime they would bring their lunch into Louise's bedroom and have lunch with her. That's how interesting she was. She entertained the college boys when they were home working for Safari. George said he wouldn't miss a day.
Yeah.
They'd just go in with their bag lunch and sit with her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you, when Buddy Morona visited her, which was often, her eyes lit up. She thought Buddy was the coolest thing. Yeah, they just told stories about old Millbrook, and she loved Buddy.
Yeah.
great.
I try to go to visit her every once in a while, especially after, like, we had a historical society there, you know, and bring a tape or something. And one day she said to me, it was after Palm Sunday, and she said, could you, Mrs. O'Neill, could you please bring me a piece of palm? I didn't get a piece of palm. So I went to Father Reynolds, and I said, Father, can I have a piece of palm? And he said, that's always been taken care of. He said, she asked her minister to, or one of the ministers, or maybe it was even Father Reynolds, and he brought it, somebody brought it down, a piece of palm, yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Perfect. Perfect.
Drop of rain, right?
Well, that looks wonderful. I am so glad.
Came out good, yeah.
Oh, it did. And what a wonderful.
Worth it. It was worth the work. It was worth the effort.
Well, you know, with the book, but even if we hadn't had the book, even if we all had to donate.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure.
You know, I mean, because she was such a wonderful, wonderful person. Before we leave the cemetery, St. Peter's Cemetery in Lithgow, I just wanted to read a little bit about the placement of Louise's, or say a little bit about the placement of Louise's stone in regards to her grandparents' stone. Now, as I stand facing her stone, to the extreme left is her grandfather, William D. Hale, 1851 to 1921. And just to the left of Louise's is her grandmother, Louisa Cutler Hale, 1851 to 1949. Louise's stone comes next. Louise M. Tompkins, 1907 to 1991. And next to that, to the extreme right, is Hilda Bowers' stone, 1900 to 1988, and it says on the bottom, a friend, which certainly Hilda was a wonderful friend to Louise. Now, Grandpa William D. Hale's stone faces the opposite direction. It faces, I guess, north, while the others face south. But the stone is, it's loose. It's disconnected. It's not cemented to the ground. So there is a very strong possibility that in mowing or something it was moved and it was put in the opposite direction. All the four stones, Grandpa's, Grandma's, Louise's, and Hilda's, are all just flat stones that are sitting on the grass. Grandma Cutler stone is receding into the soil quite badly. Grandma Louise Cutler Hale stone is sinking into the ground. Grandpa William D. Hale stone is above the ground, but it is not attached to its foundation. Louise's stone was also sinking into the ground, and the Historical Society had it raised and put on a cement foundation. They also had the stone cleaned, and it looks lovely. And as Jean Armstrong said, it might be a very good idea if our Historical Society cleaned the other stones and raised them up and put cement foundations under them so that they had the proper respect that they should have. Now, Hilda Bowers doesn't have a stone. She has a plaque, but it's a lovely brass plaque with a rose on it, and that's level to the ground also. Now, after Louise died, for a number of years, there was no date of her death on the stone, and as Jean Armstrong mentioned earlier, we believe it was because Grandma and Grandpa Hale purchased their stones and also Louise's stone, and of course they preceded her in death, and when they purchased the stone they had her name and her date of birth put on, but of course not her date of the death because they preceded her. So that was never, and being she was the last one in the family, that her date of death was never put on the stone. And then the Historical Society decided that really something should be done because there was no no mention of Louise being our town historian, and she was such a wonderful one. So we took it on as a project to erect a stone with a plaque for her. So Bob King of Allen's Funeral Home thought about putting on what they call a pillow stone. It's just a little stone that sits up about 18 inches from the soil, from the ground, and it's a like a bolster pillow that you use in bed to sit up with, and that was purchased and erected. And we also bought a bronze plaque, and on the bronze plaque it says Town Historian 1973 to 1985 noted author. Now the work for the plaque and the purchase of the stone and the cleaning of Louise's stone and the cement foundation was all paid for by the book that Gene Armstrong edited, which was Memories of Early Millbrook, which Gene Armstrong, who is now our secretary, compiled and put together from Louise's some of the old writings that she had, the stories she had in the newspaper. So it's really very, very lovely, and it's a wonderful tribute to Louise and her family, and also that Hilda is here, because Hilda did so much to help Louise and was such a dear friend.